All right, hello, lovely people. Welcome back to the TER podcast. I'm sitting down here with Brendan James Murray, author of The School most recently, but other books as well. And we're going to attempt to talk about, being a teacher, juggling teaching, the broad system of teaching and education and what it does wrong. So, Brendan, do you want to give us a quick elevator pitch of your book for those who haven't read it?
Right. So, as you said, and thanks for having me on, by the way. It's called The School, The Ups and Downs of 1 Year in the Classroom. And I've tried to write it in such a way that it's a series of stories rather than me kind of lecturing, I suppose, on my views on teaching. And what I hope is that those stories illuminate some of the things that I think are important discussion points, I guess you could say, about teaching teaching today. Some of those things, as you said, centre on improvements or areas that I think we could do a lot better for our kids. But then others are also, I think, really positive things. So I've tried to offer a bit of a balance so that when perhaps non-teachers read the book, they see the problems that we face, but they also see the really wonderful things about this profession as well.
Yeah, I'll just pass on, everyone I know who's read the book was moved by it, as teachers and non-teachers alike. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
If I was to sell it to someone, it'd be kind of it'd be like the more positive Gabby Stroud book. What was her book called? Teacher or something?
Teacher, yeah. I'm just looking up to my shelf because I think it's up there somewhere.
Yeah. In the same way, you kind of it felt like reading her book was like a punch in the face of like, oh, that's me. That's what I do. That's our profession. That's what we are.
Yeah.
But then quite depressing at the end, whereas yours is more uplifting. And I guess the really interesting part is that you're almost like a secondary or tertiary character in the book. How did you make the decision to sort of foreground the students and to make you recede into the background a little bit?
Well, I suppose the main reason I think is just the kids' stories. Certainly the students who I write about are far, far more interesting than I am. I sort of look at the lives that they've led, the experiences that they've had, the challenges that they've overcome. And by comparison, I think, gee, I've had it pretty easy. Whether it be myself or those kids, we've all been on this journey to come together in this classroom, and some of their journeys have been really tough, but also really inspiring as well. And as you say, I've written about other things prior to writing this book. And as a non-fiction writer, I always go out there and I find people who have really, really interesting stories. And to some degree, that was my starting point here. So it wasn't a difficult decision for me to say, well, let's really focus on these kids' lives as opposed to my day-to-day life, even though there are aspects of that in there, of course.
For sure. And I mean, it's kind of like, yeah, I'd recommend it, especially for sort of new teachers or pre-service teachers or early career teachers, because as you talk about in the book, the kind of class divide, as a teacher, you sort of see the tip of the iceberg and you think, oh, that kid was ratty or those sort of things. How hard was it for you to sort of go below the tip of the iceberg and find out all the things about these students?
It wasn't too hard in the sense that I deliberately, the students who I reached out to were people who, when I'd taught them, I'd had a pretty good rapport with them anyway. So it was coming from that starting point. And of course, they're all in their 20s now. So they're young adults out in the world, young grown-ups out in the world. So it was easy enough, I suppose, doing it now, even though there were challenges as there always are. But of course, some aspects of those stories, if I think back to when I was actually teaching them, I only had the tip of the iceberg, or I didn't actually know. So I suppose if we were to step back and say, well, how does a teacher see what's below that tip of the iceberg for kids who they're teaching right now, as opposed to having a conversation with them years down the track when they're adults, and maybe it's less useful at that time for us as teachers. I think that's a way, way, way bigger challenge.
Do you think there's a level that it's not that like maybe I'm overselling the necessity of what's underneath the iceberg. How much as a teacher do you feel is necessary to know or not know about a student?
No, I think, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I suppose we don't need to know every last detail of a child's life, I suppose, but there are certainly things that are really, really important for us to know. I mean, we all know this from our day-to-day experiences. Even just the other day, I was talking to a boy online who didn't have a laptop. We're obviously all working in remote at the moment. And I'd had some issues sort of getting him into class and getting him on a laptop. And one of the things that he mentioned to me as we were working through this, and he was being really lovely, you know, there was no defiance or anything like that. But I discovered by talking to him that his dad had recently had a stroke. So, for example, driving down to the school to pick up a laptop, which for us seems like a really simple thing, for that kid and that family was not so simple. So, as we all know as teachers, things like that, of course, it's always going to be useful. It's that information is power, I suppose.
For sure. And throughout the book, your superpower as a teacher is clearly maybe empathy first and relationship second in that order, which is perhaps uncommon in that respect. If you were to, again, following on from the new teacher idea, if you were to try and explain strategies or approaches to what makes you develop those sort of relationships, what kind of practical things are you doing that perhaps other teachers aren't?
That's a really hard question. I think I've always been, and I don't say this is a boastful way. I guess I just say this is kind of what I'm like. Even from when I was a really little kid, I was always a really, really sort of sensitive kid, and in some ways, I'm a really sensitive grown up, and it's just kind of what I'm like. And sometimes that can actually be not a very good thing in your life in different ways. But I think in teaching, it can be really, really good if you sort of harness it in the right way. I like to think everyone, by and large, gets into teaching because they do care about kids. There might be slightly different starting points. It might be a certain subject that you're passionate about that is sort of the starting point. But I think that's there from the beginning, and it's in some cases it's just a matter, I think, of not forgetting that was part of the reason that we started. Because I guess the longer we teach, the easier it can be to get caught up in all the other complexities and challenges and maybe frustrations of the job. So I guess it's kind of like that little plant that we have to remind ourselves to keep watering, that we care about these kids, and we're in this great position to be a caring adult in their lives, where in some cases the caring adults in their lives, there may be none in some cases, or well, we all know that kids come from difficult backgrounds in some cases. So yeah, I suppose that's the best way I can answer that question. I don't know that you can really teach empathy and caring. I think you've just got to do your best to care for the kids. Yeah, I don't know. Perhaps the fact I'm a little bit lost for words. Perhaps because I am still coming to terms with, well, if I met a brand new teacher and I wanted them to be as empathetic as possible, how would I support that? And I'm not exactly sure how I would do it.
I guess, yeah, like I say, it's very clearly your gift as a teacher and perhaps as a person as well. So it's probably not something you need to necessarily work on in the same way. You know, you wouldn't ask a top athlete to explain how they do their craft because it came naturally to them rather than hard work. Was there ever a time when you sort of, changed your personality as a teacher early on, or at any point when you were kind of beaten down, as you say, by the treachery of teaching?
Yeah.
Did that ever come and go, or is it something you've always been able to nurture?
I think I've mostly always come back to that kind of default position because it's pretty inherent to how I am. I know, for instance, one of my weaknesses as a teacher is that I'm not tough enough. And there are times when I think, I wasn't tough enough in that situation, or I let something go for too long, or whatever it might be. And when I was earlier in my career, I used to try to, at times, not often, but at times I would try to be that tougher teacher, because I felt like, okay, I need to be tougher. I need to be that tougher teacher. But now that I've done it a bit longer, I have that attitude of, it's that whole thing of it takes a village to raise a child, and maybe they've got me period 1 and I'm kind of the softie, but then maybe period 2, they've got the teacher who's a bit tougher. And amongst all of us who teach these kids, we give them everything that they need by offering them each what we do best, perhaps.
Yeah, for sure. In terms of you're talking about the students with these amazing lives, and by what it sounds like you're hinting at the fact that you feel your life isn't that outrageously crazy. You teach at the same place that you were a student, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So how would you do you view your life as linear or boring in that sense?
I think some other people view it that way. In fact, I know they do, because they've more or less told me in a friendly, humorous kind of way. But I mean, there's a reason that I'm at that school. It's because I have such a strong connection to the place, and to the school as well, and the community. And I think that I get a lot of energy and inspiration from that. I'm not saying, of course, that I'll be at that school until I retire, but it's not like I've kind of made the decision because I didn't feel confident to leave or anything like that. It was a decision that I made, and that for the time being, I'm really happy with and happy being there.
Yeah, nice. I was just before we jumped on, I was reading something about your dream being to teach half-time and to write half-time, or to write full-time, or is that kind of a pull at the moment, or has that always been a pull between kind of your two loves?
Yeah, well, yeah, I've always had that passion for writing, and the question I get asked somewhat frequently is, if you were able to, would you write full-time? And the answer to that is no, I wouldn't, because I couldn't imagine not being in a classroom teaching. But yeah, I think for me, a lovely balance would, and I mean, to some degree, I'm somewhat striking that balance now, but a nice balance between the writing and the teaching, because I think certainly for me as an English teacher, those two things go together so well. I talk to my kids all the time about my writing, and more now as they're finding out about it, they're asking me about it too. Which I just think creates a really nice kind of energy. You know, it's like, I guess you can be an extraordinary English teacher without being a writer. There's no question about that. But certainly, given that it's my passion, it's something that I can bring into the classroom quite easily.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. All righty. And so sort of you talked a lot about the trauma and the bullying in your own schooling life, and the kind of the echoes of that kicking around in the same school years later. Do you think that's true for most teachers? They're trying to fulfill something or get something right that they did wrong, or am I psychoanalyzing too quickly in the piece?
Yeah, I'm all for the psychoanalysis. I reckon that's good. But well, I guess it's inevitable, isn't it? If you become a teacher, you've got to reflect on your experiences as a student. And probably you take those experiences that you had that were wonderful and that were inspiring and all the rest of it, and you try to repeat those in different ways. And you take the experiences that you had that weren't so good, and you either steer clear of them in your own practice, if it's something to do with the way a teacher behaved in the classroom, or you try really hard to create that safe environment if it's something like bullying. So whether we become teachers for that reason, I'm not so sure of, but definitely, whether or not that's the case, definitely, surely every teacher is thinking back on when they were at school and using that as a resource to draw on in terms of their own teaching.
And I mean, an idea that I really liked from, again, I'm not exactly sure where I picked up all these things, but you commented on basically your students are amazing, but people seem to think of them as, flipping through their phone and disconnected from the world and all those sort of things. Do you think anything essential has changed from the childhood of yours to the childhood of the students that you teach now?
I think at its core, it's probably the same. That this core thing of childhood is probably, perhaps, I don't know, maybe it was the same 100 years ago or 500 years ago, that experience of being a kid and coming into the world and finding your way and having fun, but also getting knocked down and learning lessons from that. There is, of course, all this stuff that we worry about, modern technology and how that changes things. I mean, I'm sure I can speak for you when I say we're probably both very glad that Facebook and all that sort of stuff wasn't huge when, well, I mean, I don't know, I'm not sure how old you are, but certainly Facebook, all that sort of stuff. Like, I think a kid got a mobile phone when I was in year 12, and that was like a big thing. Like, oh, some kids have a mobile phone. So there's that whole thing. But going back to your original comment too, that the bizarre, so many people say to us, as we know as teachers, when maybe you meet someone who new and they find out you're a high school teacher and they have that reaction of, oh, how do you do that? You know, I couldn't possibly imagine, you know, that like we're prison guards or something. And it's a kind of strange perspective that people have.
And just to make it practical, you touched on it earlier, just like as a teacher who also is a writer, how do you, if, you know, someone's listening and they also have dreams to be, you know, similarly engaged in that kind of work, how do you actually juggle it? Is it all late nights and weekends after baby goes to bed or those sort of things? Or how do you approach it?
Well, I should say I haven't written anything since our new baby has been born. So I can't speak for it. She's only 2 months old, so I can't speak from that perspective. But certainly, I mean, I've always written even since I was a really, really little kid. So there's that, for me, there's that real pull to do it. So it's not, sometimes it can be hard, but it's not always hard to find the time because I have this real desire to do it. And it's sort of an excitement. You know, I might be at work during the day and I'm thinking, oh, I can't wait to get home tonight and work on this chapter that I've been thinking about. Having a absolutely lovely, supportive wife certainly helps. But yeah, this whole thing of teachers will sometimes say things, English teachers in particular, I find, and I think I've even said this before, oh, I can only read on school holidays because I don't have time with all my correction and everything during the term. I just think we need to be a bit kinder to ourselves and allow ourselves that time to do the things like that we love, because there is time for it, and I think it makes you a better teacher. And I would say if anyone is listening and is thinking, oh, I'd love to write something, but I feel like I don't have the time is there if you can find it, and if you're willing to be kind to yourself and just say, well, maybe I won't do that pile of correction tonight. Maybe I'll sit down for an hour and write something and see how that feels, and maybe talk to the kids about it the next day and they get something from it as well.
Sure. And when I was reading the book, I had this sense of you living this quite ascetic lifestyle, you know, by the ocean, and, you know, it seems very light on technology and old TVs being shunted around. How much on technology are you, and how much are you, you know, with your thoughts where you live?
Well, back then when I very first started teaching, it was a bit like that. I lived it was virtually this little shack, which isn't even there anymore. And yeah, it was a pretty simple sort of existence. I was quite happy with that, you know, living like that. And a lot of people down here have got that connection to the beach. We love going to the beach and being around the ocean and so on. I think since that time, and this is probably a bad thing, I've become much, much, much more engaged with technology. And certainly in lockdown, I've actually been thinking, and my wife has pointed out to me quite rightly, that I'm spending way too much time on my phone.
Yeah, I think that's true for all of us. Just pivoting from there, how have you found the whole teaching from a screen? We just hit, what, 203 odd, 4 maybe days of online teaching in Victoria. How are you finding that shuffle?
Yeah. I suppose it's two extremes. The really good thing is I feel like we've figured it out now, how to do it well. And I feel like the kids are really getting something out of it. I was reflecting on this just the other morning with one of my classes. I was thinking, wow, this is really working. You know, we use Google Classroom at my school, and before the first lockdown, I basically had no idea how to use Google Classroom. I knew it existed, but I hadn't touched it or anything. And now I'm like, I love Google Classroom and it can do all these different things and it's awesome. And I'm thinking, you know, let's use it when we're back at school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the positive. The negative is just all the kids who aren't there. And that is the worry, because my experience, and I'm sure others' experience as well, is that as soon as you go into remote, there's a few kids who they start to fade out, and then after a week or two, some of them disappear entirely. And I know the school does a whole heap of work to get them engaged and get them logged on and all the rest of it. But it's very, very hard when they're not actually coming in physically to a place each day.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if a book like The School could ever be written in 2023 or something, you know, after spending 6 years with students via, you know, Zoom, Microsoft, Google, whatever it is.
Yeah. It changes the relationship, I think, in a lot of ways. I mean, as humans, I guess we're supposed to be interacting with one another in person, and at the end of the day, even now, sitting across from one another, looking at one another, we're not actually seeing one another. We're just seeing these little lights on a screen that are giving us the illusion that we're looking at the person. It's it's just something strange and disconnected about it. But it just is what it is, I guess. There's no way around it for the time being, at least. Yeah,
for sure. I'm going back into your, I keep thinking discography, but that's obviously not the word for a bibliography, which it doesn't fit anymore.
Discography sounds way cooler.
Doesn't it, right? Like, you know, I like your early stuff better than your new stuff. So you've got The Drowned Man, about that in everything I read, it's begun in a fish and chip shop in, I imagine, where you live. Can you talk us through the sort of how that comes into existence?
Yeah, so quite some years ago now, I suppose, to put it in context, my grandfather was in the Navy, and the Navy was very much his life. He and I had a very close relationship, and he used to talk about it all the time. And so I had a tendency to talk to old people about their wartime experiences, because that's just the relationship we had. And anyway, yeah, I heard this story. It was just a chance meeting where a guy talked about a homosexual man being murdered on a ship. And it was a ship that my grandfather had served briefly on. And so he was still alive at that time. He's since passed away. I went and talked to him about it, and he said, yeah, I'd heard that rumor as well. So I just went from there and researched it and went on this journey to find out, could this be true? And I came out of that with some very changed perspective. I think previously I had a very, very romanticized, idealized view of Australia's military history. And I think I came out of it with not a cynical, but a more realistic view of our military history. I'll put it in that way.
All right. And so it seems like your writings are very almost journalistic then. Like, obviously it's non-fiction, but are you going on using your school holidays to go traveling to find these sort of stories, these ideas, or are you staying put? Like, how do you kind of juggle all that?
Yeah, definitely using school holidays to travel around. Certainly with The Drowned Man at that time, my wife and I, like, we didn't live together yet, or we weren't married or anything at that time. So, you know, I had a bit more, less of a responsibility to be the partner who was present, if I can put it that way. With the school more recently, and a lot of that was in lockdown as well. So it was a lot of interviews like what you and I are doing right now. So over that remote medium. And I think a lot of writing in the future, maybe people are going to realize, and maybe I've realized, that even if it's not as good in terms of that human connection level, it's certainly a very, very efficient means of gathering information and meeting up with people and talking to people. Like, I remember with The Drowned Man at one point traveling to South Australia to interview some people, and you think, well, if that happened now, would I still travel there, or would I try to arrange something like this? And I'm not sure, maybe I'd try to arrange something like this.
Yeah, right. And then Venom, the heroic search for Australia's deadliest snake. I was one of the 26 people who listened to you address the heptological
Herpetological Society. Yeah.
Herpetological Society. How do you sort of come to that story? Were you at the fish and chip shop again, or
no? So that's I'm not in that one at all. So that's that was a bit easier to write in the sense that there was no personal disclosure whatsoever in that one. So it was one of the things that I was interested in growing up as a kid was venomous snakes, and I think maybe a lot of kids are interested in wildlife and that type of thing. And I still find that that's a way you can really engage kids talking about that sort of stuff. And I'd heard this story about the taipan in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, which was an extremely deadly snake, and there was no cure. If you got bitten, it was a death sentence, and often a very rapid, very horrible death that people would suffer. And I'd heard about these young scientists at that time who'd gone out to try to capture live taipans at great personal risk to develop an anti-venom. And I was talking to my publisher about things that I'd like to write about, and that was one of the things that I mentioned. And the publisher at that time said, she was really quite interested in that and really keen on it. So I ended up writing it, and yeah, people seem to have really enjoyed it. It's an unusual bit of Australian history, at least. Very few people, when they read the book, turn around and say, oh yeah, we already knew all this. But so it's unique, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And then so 2016, 2017, and then jump to 2021 to write the school. What were you working on between then and kind of, it seems odd that you would come to the thing that you've been doing for perhaps the longest. Is it because it was a personal sort of story, or what took you that long to get to the teaching book?
Yeah, I think part of it is that part of writing for me has always been a degree of escapism, much like reading. So coming home from work and writing a short story or writing a chapter of a novel or something like that, it's you go to another place and you can completely step mentally out of your world and come back refreshed in a way if you're writing about World War II or scientists running around in the bush in the 40s or whatever. So it was, there was some reluctance to write the school initially. And I have to admit, by the time I'd finished writing it, I did feel a bit oversaturated with just thinking about school and education, because I was teaching all day long, whether it was on site or remotely, because it was a bit of both. And then writing often late into the night about teaching and about school. By the end of it, I was like, wow, that's a whole lot of school. I like teaching, but it was a bit of overload. So I think that's why it took me a while to get to that point of writing about teaching.
You might have been the only teacher to write yourself into burnout, just overwork through doing and writing.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, right. Okay. So I've got a whole bunch of things, not surprisingly, that are sort of, as you've said elsewhere, kind of at the end of chapters, you'll sneak in we think of it as maybe, the poison that helps the medicine go down, or vice versa. The sort of, that plan sucks, by the way, and exams are a bit silly. And anyway, on to the next thing, and often through sort of metaphor. And I guess metaphor is a nice way, we've got to be careful as two English teachers having a conversation and not go too deep on the metaphor or the psychoanalysis. But, to keep it brief, you always have to have a metaphor, your jelly beans for your NAPLAN, those sort of things, kind of cut it down. If you had more space, how would you explore something like examinations and the ATAR and the sort of VCE kind of idea? If you were to try and change it or expand on your thoughts on that, how would you sort of explain it?
Well, it's funny because I've been asked a lot about this since writing the book, and it's only, I think, since I've written it and been asked questions like the one you're asking right now, which is a great question, that's allowed me to get to a point where I think I can answer it better than I could before I was, or even during when I was writing the book, because I used to have a bit of a cop-out kind of thought, which was, well, here are some things I'm identifying as problems. That having been said, the solutions to these problems are for minds greater than mine, because I can't say, well, here's how we fix it. But I suppose from a philosophical perspective, I've come to a point where I think the key word is balance. And at times, that's what I feel is lacking. I think there's been some misinterpretation, not by many people, but a couple of people have sort of read the book and thought, well, Brendan thinks that there should be no quantitative data, that we shouldn't measure anything, which is, of course, the last thing that I think, because we need to measure things to determine when our teaching has worked well and determine progress and all the rest of it. But at times I have a sense, and I believe other teachers have the same sense because they've told me that, so it's not just, I'm not just talking about my school, that sometimes there isn't that sense of balance. There's that sense of it's too much of a focus on quantitative data over, for instance, qualitative data. Or when you talk about exams, it's too much of a focus on the ATAR score and ultimately tertiary institutions' selection processes, because that's all that the ATAR score is really about. It's too much of a focus on that. So where I think the conversation needs to start is, how do we actually achieve that balance, whether it's in standardized testing or examinations or anything. And if we were to become too, I don't even know what the word is to describe it. Well, let's say if we were to just be the really lovey-dovey, touchy-feely, let's go out and build sculptures out of mud every day, and that's going to be how we run schools, that would be equally bad, because there would be no balance there either. So yeah, I think we need to strike a balance is how I would respond to that question.
Yeah, nice. And how do you sort of manifest those beliefs in your teaching? So like, how do you communicate to your students that there needs to be a balance? And you've already mentioned, like, that you will explain, well, instead of marking, I went home and I wrote a chapter. I did what's good for me. I went to the ocean, whatever it is. How do you kind of communicate that expectation or idea to your students, especially say VCE literature, where you're expecting big marks, hardworking students, those sort of things?
Yeah, and that's where it's the hardest, is at that year 12 level, because when it's junior kids, you do have a little bit more freedom. And I suppose the good example is that experience we all have as teachers, when something comes up that's not part of the curriculum that the kids just latch onto, and you're just like, oh, I want to go with this. I want to follow that path, and I want to explore it. And what I try to do is, certainly with my junior kids, I will do that. Of course, it's not going to be completely irrelevant, but I'll follow those paths. Year 12, it is so hard because there is all this pressure in terms of, I mean, I want to be fair to my school. My school doesn't make me feel like I'm being judged purely on the results of my year 12 students. So I want to be clear about that. However, and I'm sure this is the case at many schools, once the year 12 results come in, the pigeonhole is suddenly full of graphs and numbers and your class versus the state, and your class on this task versus the state, and this is how this student has performed based on how we think they were going to perform on the gap. And I think for every teacher, that creates this sense that, well, if we're drifting from the curriculum, if we're drifting from those things that are going to drive the students' results up, even if to drift is to actually create more passion in the students in terms of them being lifelong learners, there's a bit of a tendency to pull back from that. And I'm as guilty as anyone in that regard, certainly with my senior students, because I do feel that pressure and also the obligation to the kids, because I don't think as a society, even, you could make it even bigger than the school, I don't think as a society we've got the balance right between learning and the ATAR, in my view.
Yeah, I guess like it's kind of teachers, sort of conceive of teachers as kind of like the string in a guitar, and the system is sort of tightening us, but it doesn't take much to set us off, because we are, you know, as you sort of described yourself, the kind of empathetic, hardworking, diligent, rule following, whatever. So if you move the rules in a certain way, then we'll, in some respects, bend to the will of the rule. How do you,
Definitely.
and so pulling this through to your kind of the story of the teacher who gave the strap very lightly kind of thing, how do you see yourself working as an activist against the system or within the confines of the system, but in a different manner? How do you sort of approach that?
Yeah, so I try to voice my views amongst the staff, even just like within my own staff room, my own little office with only a few staff. You know, there's only 3 of us in there. We all get along really well. But I think being willing to have those conversations, and in the context of, I like to think, and I hope that my colleagues see me in this way, that I also speak up regularly about the really positive things, and I'll talk to teachers who I really admire, and you know, I'll point out to them how much I admire them and things like that, so that when you do say something that's maybe controversial or maybe runs against what's the accepted wisdom in schools at the moment, you're not perceived as just a blocker or a whinger. It's just a part of that mosaic of the contributions that you're making to try to make your school and schools generally better. So it's the balance of the positive things, but also the challenging things. And it's funny because I feel like it's almost like there's these 2 worlds. There's the world of what the government demands, I suppose, in terms of standardized testing and all the rest of it. And then there's the world of almost every single teacher on the ground who, that they all seem to be saying the same thing, which is that, yeah, things could be better. So I suppose empowering us as teachers to have the confidence, and I've said this on a few platforms, to actually speak up to government and say, trust us. We know how to do this. We know how to do this well. And you don't have to sort of force us to do all this testing, because we're going to do the testing because we know testing is important, but we're going to do it in the right ways and the right amounts. So having the confidence to speak up, but also speaking up positively and not just negatively all the time, I think is the best approach.
Yeah, for sure. And so I guess you've been given I won't say given, you've earned the platform as sort of a teacher representative in that respect. And not in an overly academic way, which, you know, if you were asked me the NAPLAN question, it'd be like, strap in and bring your references, and no one would want to hear that. Or like you say, there's maybe like, and I don't want to paint Gabby Stroud too broadly, but, you know, the kind of things are crap and I'm out of here concept. And then you're sort of the relatively moderate, but sort of realistic, I feel, sort of somewhere in the middle. How have you found kind of moving from a teacher out in, not whoop whoop, but, you know, out on the outskirts, to sort of being on TV and radio and those sort of things? How have you found that transition? Obviously, you've spoken about books all the way along before, but sort of being thrown into the educational debate, let's say.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great privilege, isn't it, to be in this position where we can talk about the profession that we're passionate about and get our views out there. So I see it as a great privilege. The fact that I have written those other 2 books eased me into it, I think, somewhat. It's an interesting one, because at the same time, I mean, I don't consider myself to be super teacher. And I think sometimes there's this sense of, you know, oh, here's a guy who's talking about teaching, he must be super teacher, or he must think he's super teacher. And I definitely don't. I look around at all the people that I work with, and I think any one of them could be in this position to be saying these things. I guess it's just the fact that because I'm a writer and I've written this book, there's a tendency to say, oh, well, you know, tell us more about those things that you've written about. But I just try to, try not to take it for granted, and try to be as fair about it as I can. And I think well, you alluded to that NAPLAN thing I wrote in the book about the fact, and again, this is a sort of uncomfortable conversation in a way, especially from someone like me who has been critical of NAPLAN, that sometimes the teachers who are the most critical of standardized testing are teachers who are really disengaged and who we might actually in some cases call bad teachers. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who has got a problem with NAPLAN falls into that category, because I've got a problem with NAPLAN and I don't think I'll fall into that category. But we need to have those tough conversations and say, well, okay, we've got a problem with standardized testing. Why do we have that problem? And what is the nature of those feelings that we have? And sometimes it might come from the right place, and sometimes it might come from the wrong place. And one of the worst things I think we can do as teachers in terms of the perspective, in terms of how the community sees us, is try to present ourselves as these unassailable, perfect martyrs who never do anything wrong. I think one of the best things we can do if we want the community out there to take us seriously and take us seriously as a profession is say things like, well, yeah, you know, we're not perfect. There are bad teachers out there. There are also lots and lots of great teachers. And those are the sorts of conversations I think we need to be willing to have.
Yeah, for sure. Sort of the tropes of the super teacher and the cool teacher and the terrible teacher and all those sort of things. Yeah, it's a tricky one because it's sort of, yeah, I do think there's a kernel of distrust or discomfort among the teaching profession towards tests. But as you say, at some point you sort of need to say, well, you know, if PISA says Australia's doing relatively poorly and our NAPLAN results are trending down, those sort of things, and there's a whole range of other tests we could look at. But yeah, there is a tendency to kind of see that as a bit of an attack on us necessarily. So yeah, I don't know. How would you engage with those kind of the sky's falling, things are getting worse? I mean, you know, you mentioned literature's on the decline as well, and how do you tap into things are bad but we can do better? Like what is your vision for how we might do that better? Big question, obviously.
Yeah, it is a big one. I mean, the first thing I think we need to acknowledge, it comes back to that counting the jelly beans in the jar metaphor, which I use for NAPLAN, is being really open and honest about what NAPLAN is and what it actually can measure. So if, let's say, a school is not doing very well on NAPLAN and the school up the road is doing really well on NAPLAN, asking questions like, well, is that because the one school's teaching really well and the other isn't, or is it because one school is drilling NAPLAN and the other is not teaching to NAPLAN? So I suppose being willing to engage with that, but then also being willing to engage with the fact that there are aspects of NAPLAN that measure things quite well. So my personal view, and again, this is just my personal view, and we might be getting too much into the weeds here in terms of your question, but as an example, the multiple choice section of NAPLAN, the reading section, it is what it is. But certainly I don't think there's much of a place for teaching kids multiple choice test taking skills. Now, there are people who disagree with me on that, and they'll say things like, well, kids have to do multiple choice when they're going for their license. They're going to have to do multiple choice maybe at uni on exams and stuff like that. Let's teach them how to do multiple choice tests. That, I think, starts to get quite ugly. And you start to think, well, in terms of creating a lifelong learner as an English teacher, do I want to be sitting down and explaining the pitfalls of the all of the above option? So there's that. But then you look at something else, like the creative or persuasive written response on NAPLAN. Now, I think they're often quite good tasks. The students have some time, they have a prompt, but they can largely do what they want with that prompt. And they have an opportunity to show who they are as a little writer at that point in time with that task. So it's extremely complicated. You can, and I often do, get lost in the weeds with it. But I guess it still just comes back to, for me, it comes back to balance, because I think in a lot of cases, a lot of non-teachers would probably be quite shocked if they knew the degree to which tests like NAPLAN drive what happens in classrooms on a day-to-day basis. And I may be wrong here, but I don't believe that was ever the intention of NAPLAN.
No, definitely not, nor should it be. I've just got a question out of the blue here. Within your school, do you have sort of leadership aspirations, or is kind of your writing, your teaching enough? Like, have you ever been a coordinator or a AP or those sort of positions? Do those appeal?
I haven't done those things, and honestly, this might sound like a strange response. This is the honest truth. I legitimately think I'm too soft for those jobs. And I have a huge amount of respect for the people who do them and the people who do them well, and I really admire that. And for my skill set, I'm quite open about the fact that I don't think I'm well suited to that type of work. And I remember when my current principal, I've got a fantastic principal at the moment, when she started at our school, she called everyone into her office, had a little sit down with them and asked them what their aspirations were. And I said that my aspiration is to be the best classroom teacher that I can be. And that, for me, that really is where it's at for me. The more time I spend in the classroom, the happier I am at work at the moment. And that, again, is no judgment whatsoever of the many wonderful people I know who have roles that require significant time allowance, which take them out of the classroom. But just for me and what I enjoy and the skills that I have, I want to spend as much time in the classroom as I can. Although I do have leadership aspirations in that broader sense of being I suppose, a voice, if you like, for education and for the students. And I take as a great example, I'm sure it's okay for me to mention her by name, Deb Fisher, who is a mutual friend of ours. Like what a leader with a capital L in my view. Yet in the time I worked with her, she might have had various roles, but I don't remember her being a coordinator or an assistant principal or anything like that. It was simply the way she spoke about what she was doing, the way she taught, the contributions she would make in meetings, her approach to the job, her interactions with staff. To me, that made her a fantastic leader, and that's the type of leadership I guess I would aspire to.
Would you ever see a place for an education system where you would be given time to do those kind of things?
How do you mean?
Like if we said, okay, well, Brendan's proven himself, he's the public face of teaching. We'll take him off one class, and he can spend time just working on his writing, representing teachers, doing his social media tweeties, whatever, because no one understands what that is. Would that be an appealing offer if someone were to make that a possibility?
Yeah, no, I think something like that would be appealing. Yeah, I think so. I think if there was that sense that, well, I suppose like anyone, if you feel like you're doing something that really suits your skill set and is going to make a difference, of course, why not? You would embrace it.
And then, so if your ambitions are as a classroom teacher, what about as a writer? What's the top ambition you're aiming for? The Pulitzer? What's the goal? What are we aiming at?
I'm not sure. That's a good question, because I always wanted to publish a book, and I never believed that it would ever happen. Like legitimately, I just thought it was this sort of unattainable dream, which perhaps goes slightly to maybe some of my skewed perceptions that I had when I was younger, because that's a bit of a defeatist way of looking at something. But I think I was just so stunned when I got a book published. I was like, wow, I've achieved what I wanted to achieve. And only now am I starting to think more seriously, like, well, okay, I've written 3 books now. What am I really wanting to achieve here? At the moment, I'm not overthinking it, and I'm just continuing doing what I'm doing, which is I just love finding really interesting stories, immersing myself in those stories. I find that to be such an enjoyable and fascinating thing to do. It's just so interesting for me. And then being able to share those with people, getting those stories out there is just a really, really rewarding thing. One day I would love to write and have published a novel. Full disclosure, I've written one novel that I have not found a publisher for. And I sort of think, well, maybe my strength is nonfiction, but one thing I'd love to do at some point would be to publish a fictional novel.
Yeah, because that was going to be my next question. Because Peter Carey's a massive figure in the book, and I've just finished My Life as a Fake, which is very much fiction and almost magical realism with some sort of magic thrown in there, a hint of it anyway. So yeah, okay. So what can you tell us about? Give us the novel sitting on the desk drawer novel. What's the pitch?
Well, no, I've gone completely cold on it now. That I need.
It's literally in the desk drawer. Okay.
Yeah, literally. I know I've gone really cold on it. So I think one of the questions I'm asking myself now is, do I want to, when I do get around to writing again, is it going to be a novel? In which case I would start something new as opposed to going back and reworking that novel, because I've sort of fallen out of love with it, I guess, if you put it in that way. Or would I write something nonfiction? And I think it'll just be wherever my interest takes me. If I stumble upon some really interesting true story that I hear about, I'll go down that path. Or if I think of an idea that is inspiring for me that's fictional, I'll go down that path.
Yeah, gotcha. And what would be the next? What's on the slate for nonfiction books?
Again, it's really it's really clear horizons at the moment. I don't have anything lined up, and that's been somewhat deliberate, because obviously, as I said, our first daughter Matilda was born just 8 weeks ago, so it's very much been in the mindset of let's focus on being a dad, and that's still been the focus. I start thinking already about writing things for her, of things that she would like to read. So maybe, I don't know, I might write something for a much younger audience, because then even if it doesn't get published, I can still give it to her when she's old enough to read it. So that the only thing I've been thinking about lately is I'd like to write something that she could enjoy as soon as possible. So that would be aimed at obviously really little kids.
Yeah, nice one. All right, well, I'll give you a couple more, and then we're almost near the end. Deb mentioned that I asked Deb what question should I ask. She said, ask him about PSD funding and sort of I believe they're changing the model for disability funding. So hopefully the Grace, and I feel strange talking about a pseudonym of a student, but do you want to tell us the story of Grace and how kind of the system worked against sort of the way she was taught?
Yeah, so and I do believe the system is changing, and I don't have enough knowledge about what the new sort of system is going to be to comment on it. But yeah, so Grace, illiterate virtually. I mean, we can play the games and say, well, she's not quite illiterate, but essentially for a student of her age in high school, she couldn't read or write. That's basically where we were at, and she was in one of my English classes. And she didn't have an aide, she wasn't funded. I was pushing very hard for her to have an aide, as were other people. And what I was eventually told was that she just missed out because she scored too highly on a visual processing test, which was literally, as it was explained to me at that time, it was literally like rearranging coloured counters. So her ability to sort of do certain things that had no relevance whatsoever to literacy had precluded her from getting funding, and it was just a really extreme example of a kid being really let down, because she was going from class to class to class to class, I guarantee it, not learning a thing, except for that time that the teachers could give her when they actually sat down with her one-to-one, which, as we know, you can only take that up to a certain point. So hers is a story that actually shocks a lot of non-teachers, because I think teachers, we know this sort of stuff happens, but non-teachers are kind of like, did this really happen? I can't believe this. And and there it is, and it raises those questions, doesn't it, about, as a society again, where we choose to put our money, and why we put it where we do, and do we feel comfortable with a little girl like Grace being sent out into the world with such a low standard of literacy that she wouldn't have even had a hope of filling out the most basic paperwork that she would need to fill out as an adult.
Yeah, for sure. Not ideal. Far from it. And so, yeah, going back to the idea of bad teachers intrigued me, because when you described sort of a student going from a soft teacher to a hard teacher to, you know, all the way through, I feel my perspective has always been one of those, maybe more than one of those teachers is invariably going to be a bad teacher or a bad whatever, in the same way they're a bad police officer and a bad whatever else. Sort of how do you approach do you think that's reasonable, or do you think more needs to be done to sort of get rid of, in you know, for lack of a better term, the bad teachers in the system?
Yeah. And I suppose there's degrees of bad as well. I remember talking to one, well, maybe I shouldn't say who it was, but one person, not at my school, in a leadership position, who talked about a teacher who wasn't doing a very good job, and this person had sat down with that teacher, and that teacher had virtually said to them, yeah, so what are you going to do about it? There's nothing else I can do for a job, so, you know, what are you going to do? That obviously is a really extreme example where we would say, yeah, I think that person should not be in a position to be a teacher. They're virtually saying, yeah, I know I'm not putting any effort, but I don't care. Then, of course, you've got that full spectrum. And, of course, support always has to come first, because we know that we all have areas of weakness, and with the right support, there's plenty of people who've become really great teachers or great contributors in different ways. I suppose, as you say, that mosaic of all the people in a school, there's learning for kids in terms of the types of teachers they have, and maybe some of them meet their needs and others don't. And it's funny, actually, that you mentioned that, and we talk about like metaphors and analogies. I was thinking the other day about when Matilda was born. My wife and I were in the hospital for a few days together, and so we had all these different midwives depending on the shifts.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting because I related that to teaching, and I thought, this is what it's like for the kids, you know. You've got this midwife, and then this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. And it's like, oh, that's the midwife that's really lovely, and, you know, really like rubs Greta's back and does all these lovely caring things. And that's the midwife who's maybe a lot less obviously caring, but she's very sciencey, and she knows how to answer all our questions and so on. And then maybe there's the
one that doesn't come into the room or something, who knows?
Well, you know, maybe there's the midwife that when we rang the hospital and said we were in labour said, no, you're not, go back to bed. And then we ended up having to call an ambulance a few hours later. True story. Right. So it is true that, yeah, there's good and bad, and there's strengths and weaknesses in every profession. I don't think we should accept teachers who aren't trying. I guess that's how I would put it. If they're not trying, either they need to make themselves absent, or we need to make themselves absent. That I think is probably the fairest way I can answer that question.
Yeah, for sure. And then bringing it back on a positive note as we close this out, just to reiterate, the book, like, you know, at points I was in tears, at points I was in happy tears, kind of the, you know, then you open the door and your kids all have a card for you, and all those sort of little things that, you know, as a teacher, you're just like, oh yeah, I have my own echoes of that same story, and it, you know, gets you every time. You mentioned basically teaching isn't the perfect job, and, you know, the ups and downs of the book show that more beautifully than many of us can express. But you say teaching is the perfect job for you. Can you just sort of sell teaching as a job for you, at least? How do you find it?
Definitely. You're never bored. There's never, you might be occasionally frustrated or tired or whatever, but you never experience boredom. You wake up every morning with the knowledge that you can make a significant difference to another person, and you can make a significant difference to a child, which I think makes that even more important, because they're vulnerable and they need people to care for them and show them the way. And you're in a position where you can learn a great deal yourself in terms of your subject area. So if you're passionate about maths or English or whatever, you can deepen that knowledge. But you can also learn so much about people through the kids that you teach. I mean, there's not many professions, I don't think, where you get exposed to get to meet so many people that not for huge amounts of time, but for long enough that you really get to know them and they become sort of a significant person in your world at that time. But look, what I always come back to is, it is, as cheesy as it sounds, it's a job where if you want to, you can make a really positive difference to people. And I think in that regard, it's there with a few other sort of core jobs that you think, well, if we took jobs away from society, what would make society stop functioning? And teaching is one of the ones that you would think of very, very, very quickly as you were compiling that list. So yeah, I think it's an amazing career that I would encourage to any young person or any older person who's thinking of a career change.
Yeah, beautifully said. That's all I've got. Thank you very much for your time. Is there anything else you want to leave us with? Any final thoughts or ideas?
No, look, just thank you so much for your interest. It's been great chatting with you. I love chatting about teaching. It's always really, really interesting and fun. So yeah, thanks for your interest and time.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you very much.